believe.
If I could ask you to do a little bit of summary of your testimony, perhaps we could get to the question sooner.
Sure.
Introduce yourself first, please.
My name is Mary O'Leary Reilly, and I'm from Altoona, where I practice full-time as a licensed psychologist. I attended Villanova University, graduated from Penn State, and did my master's and doctoral work in counseling psychology at the University of Maryland. I'm co-chair of the Special Interest Group on Adoption Research and Practice within the American Psychological Association. This group offers continuing education about adoption to psychologists throughout the United States. These workshops have focused on the provision of best clinical practice to all those whose lives are touched by adoption, including birth families, also known as original families, adoptees, and adoptive families. I've also served as a manuscript reviewer for research journals when research is submitted to those journals, and as a consultant for a variety of adoption agencies over the last 30 years. I was adopted by my parents, James and Patricia O'Leary, at 6 months of age in Minnesota, where my dad was a surgical resident. We moved home to Altoona when I was only a year old. My parents were both early advocates of what I would refer to as no-shame adoption. We were all on local TV, in fact, on WFBG TV in Altoona, to show others that adoptive families are wonderful families and that no one affiliated with adoption should ever feel ashamed. I do know that both of my parents would be proud that I have the opportunity to be here today to support HB 162, which would move the state of Pennsylvania one step closer to no-shame adoption once again. As Carolyn mentioned, until '84, adoptees were able to access their original birth certificates. It is my desire that HB 162 would restore the right that existed until that time. I'm the oldest of the 3 adopted O'Leary children. My brother Dennis, who's 2 years younger than I am, was adopted at 10 days of age and came to us straight from the hospital through Catholic Charities. My brother John, who's 3 years younger than I am, was adopted at 2 years of age. And since I was 5, I clearly remember picking him up from the Catholic Charities orphanage in Crescent, Pennsylvania. After he had walked across a big room in a red blazer with a blue bow tie to where my mom, dad, brother, and I were sitting on the sofa, the sister said to him, "Anthony, your name will now be John, and this is your new family." He started to cry, and I started to cry because I really wanted him to like us. And even then, I knew that there was something very wrong in erasing a child's identity. John always asked me over the last 50-some years to tell that story over and over again, and I now realize it was his only tie to his first 2 years of life. Interestingly enough, his original birth certificate would not have been sealed for 2 reasons. One is that was in 1959, and it was pre the 1984 seal. And number 2, he was not adopted until he was 2 years, 4 months. For those first 2 years, 4 months, it wouldn't have been sealed. It's well known in adoption circles that adopted children never grow up. We're the Peter Pans of the legal system. We're treated as children for the rest of our lives. Our adoption as children defines us. I'm 59 years old, and I'm testifying today in an attempt to modify a law that treats adopted citizens as children for their entire lives. In psychodynamic jargon, this is referred to as infantilization, the treatment of adults like infants. Knowing the truth about oneself is a part of healthy emotional development for all people. Recently, I had a client who was seeking information about herself from Catholic Charities, the agency she had been adopted through. Now, I've been on the board of Catholic Charities of Altoona Johnstown for the last 12 years, 6 as chair, and their executive director is a friend and colleague of mine. She came to my office and was nervous about telling my client the circumstances of her birth, which I understood. But I assured her that no matter what the truth is, it is far better than the millions of other scenarios that run through adoptees' minds. My client was very grateful for this information, for any information about herself. Current Pennsylvania law seals every adoptee's original birth certificate at the time of adoption. It makes it a state secret. Making the original birth certificate an estate secret stigmatizes adoptive persons for life. The amended birth certificate is not an original birth certificate. It dehumanizes and devalues the child, which is against every moral principle that I believe in. This sealing of the original birth certificate includes 3 groups. First of all, it includes the vast majority of adoption where the identity of the birth parents is already known. As you probably know, a high percentage of adoptions are step-family adoptions and foster care adoptions, where the identity of the birth parents are clear. These original birth certificates are now sealed. Second, birth certificates are sealed in the growing number of adoptions in which openness is incorporated into the adoption process, agreed upon by both the adoptive family and the birth family. Personally, nearly all the Pennsylvania adoptions with which I am familiar over the last 15 years include communication with the birth family and adoptive family. These records are sealed. Finally, birth certificates are sealed in the ever-shrinking number of adoptions that were shrouded in secrecy and shame. I have to tell you, as a clinician and a researcher, the population is shrinking as quickly as World War II veterans. It is a relic of a bygone era. The original families who relinquished children in this era of secrecy and shame report post-traumatic symptoms related to relinquishment up to 60 years later in research. It is tragic and sad, and I have worked with many of them as their psychologist. Even among this shrinking group of birth mothers, research very consistently shows that approximately 95% of them are not opposed to contact with the children that they relinquished. In fact, many of them, like my friend Carolyn and Philomena, if you saw the recently Academy Award-nominated film, spend their entire lives looking for their children. It is important to note, however, that even for this tiny percentage of birth parents who are left when we back out the preceding groups, HB 162 is not about search. It is about the original birth certificate only. It is about the adopted person's birth information being put into the category of state secret. No other records about birth are sealed for life. This is a legal anomaly that personally affects every adoptee in this state, and it is time to change it. Please note that I have great compassion for birth mothers. I work with birth mothers in my clinical practice. I've worked as the psychologist for far too many women who lived through the heartbreak of the era of secrecy and shame. I've worked with several agencies to improve their procedures. Research, in fact, shows that birth mothers are more likely to make an adoption plan for their child when they know there will be some level of openness. For the tiny, and I do mean tiny, percentage of birth mothers referred to by earlier testimony, HB 162 will not bring them humiliation and shame. The release of the original birth certificate to adoptees still gives them the right to not receive contact from their child, or to stop it in other ways. Not answering the phone. We certainly have harassment legislation. There are all kinds of ways to stop people from contacting other people. We don't need to make a birth a secret in order to do that. Adoption is a lifelong process. Lack of knowledge about oneself affects people differently at different stages of their lives. At this stage of my life, I am most concerned about the principles on which adoption is based. I believe that adoption and all structures of our society should be based on principles and virtues that we can be proud of. Principles such as honesty and integrity, principles such as the celebration of every birth and every child, regardless of the circumstances of conception. Principles such as positive attitudes toward adoption and all those whose lives are touched by adoption. And most of all, personally, I would like our principles about adoption to never ever be based on shame. Adoptees are the only class of people to be denied information about themselves by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. They are denied their original birth certificates. HB 162 would allow this to change and would allow positive principles and values to serve as the foundation of our adoption laws. I'm asking each of you to recommend HB 162 to the Senate for a vote. Thank you very much. We all deserve the right to information about ourselves without government intrusion, even those of us who are adoptees. Thank you.